Now we need to talk about what fossils are and how to make them. And the original Old Greek version was that a fossil was simply something dug up. If you got it out of the ground, that was a fossil. Today we're more precise and we define it as it says there as any evidence of a once living organism preserved in rocks. Typically, we need three things. You need animals or plants, organisms with hard parts, a skeleton. Earthworms and jellyfish and bacteria and things like that that don't have hard parts, they can preserve as fossils, but it's so rare. Generally, it's hard parts. Secondly, they need to be buried rapidly. They need to be covered by sediment as soon as possible because if they sit out long enough, they get destroyed. They get eaten up by bacteria, they get rotted away. Other organisms disperse them. Think about your average dead deer or dead possum on the side of a highway that's been hit sadly by some car. How many days does it stay there? It stays there a few days before it is decayed away to nothing. That's what happens to most living things. They get completely recycled. But if they're buried rapidly enough, they're on their way. They've hit the second benchmark for becoming a fossil. And then finally, it's not enough to just be buried. You have to be buried in the right type of environment that seals them off from what's going to destroy them. And typically, what's going to destroy them are bacteria and fungi that literally break down the material, groundwater that courses through and dissolves skeletons and things like that. And if you jump through all three of these hurdles, hard parts buried rapidly, sealed from destruction, you stand a good chance of becoming a fossil. And anything that we call a fossil, certainly all these dinosaur bones, have done these things. The next thing we have to talk about is this concept called taphonomy. It's a new word, and it's the study of all the things that happen to an organism from the point of its death to the point where somebody digs it up as a fossil. Another way to think of it is the study of preservation. And so it's a long process, and it's something that's very interesting to paleontologists today. So here's the simplest case, and it's a dinosaur. This poor dinosaur has walked along the earth and maybe it got injured, maybe it's diseased, maybe it's full of parasites, maybe it's just old, but it dies. So it's dead. That's the first part. Before it can be destroyed, like those deer or possum I mentioned before on the side of the road, if let's say there's a flood in this area and a river system dumps enough sediment on this to cover it up, or the organism dies and falls into a lake and gets covered by sediment, it gets buried. So there it's buried. Now notice here all the soft parts, the skin, the organs, the tissues are dissolving away. They get destroyed, but the hard parts continue. The burial continues. So this is just the first layer that's going on top of this thing. It keeps getting buried and cooked. After many millions of years, potentially, it is preserved in the rock as part of the rock. So it's a biological material, but now it's also a geological material. It's part of the rock. Fast forward again, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years in the future, and these rocks are now solid. These sediments are now solid rocks. They're pushed up, and they start being eroded down anew, much later. Let's say that one part of this fossil, luckily the skull is exposed, some lucky paleontologist is hiking over this area and he or she sees this, then potentially they know that the rest of this thing is down, buried down into the sediment here. So that's the life history of all fossils, wherever they're at. They die, they're buried, they're preserved as rocks, and then ultimately eroded again to the surface where they might be collected again. Now, most hard parts are what we call altered hard parts. They've been recrystallized. So these pictures you see here, these are different ocean creatures. You've got oysters, clams, snails, a nautiloid, a crab, obviously, and their skeletons were made out of different materials, but after they've been buried and then cooked and then hardened, they become recrystallized into a newer, harder material. They become rocks. And sometimes, as you can see from these things, you can have very, very fine detail preserved on these things. There are also fossils that we call trace fossils, and these are very common as well. Anything that moves through the sediment or on top of it leaves evidence of it. So here, these are a whole bunch of different things that you wouldn't normally think of. You've got all kinds of little snails and shrimp and crabs and things, and they're burrowing through the sediment. And these little holes they make, they preserve as well. We find these things probably more often than we find regular fossils. And they have evidence of where an organism ate, where it lived, how it moved, how it reproduced, all kinds of other behavior. We call this ichnology. And if you think back to when I talked about the history of dinosaurs, I mentioned Edward Hitchcock was one of the first persons to do this, to work on these, when he noted that the footprints of what he called Noah's raven were preserved in this sediment. Those are dinosaur footprints. And then let's talk specifically about dinosaur fossils. Let's talk specifically about dinosaur fossils. And what do we get there? They are almost always recrystallized bones and teeth, and then tracks of their footprints. But we also find, and we'll talk about this later, a whole bunch of other weird things. We find their fossil poop, coprolites, skin impressions, feathers, even mummies, dinosaur mummies, like the one you're looking at here. This dinosaur mummy has preserved skin, soft parts, intestines, all kinds of stuff, interestingly enough.